They say war ends when you come home. They lied. The restaurant was warm and elegant, the kind of place where wine glasses caught the light like little suns. Arlington nights always felt quieter than they should, too still for people who once lived by the sound of distant thunder. I had spent a decade building a private security firm after leaving Army CID. A few weeks ago, I sold it. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. My brother Dylan and his wife Vanessa insisted on taking me out. Jazz floated through the air, slow and low, like a heartbeat trying to stay calm. Dylan grinned over the table, his easy charm softening the years between us. He said I was finally the rich one in the family. I smiled back and told him freedom wasn't about money. Freedom was knowing you survived what others couldn't. Then came the moment I'll never forget. The waiter, a young man with steady eyes, leaned close as he set down my glass of Merlot. His voice was almost a whisper. "Ma'am, the lady in red just put something in your drink." I froze. Vanessa's laughter drifted across the table. Her red dress caught the candlelight, her smile sweet and patient, the way a hunter waits for the trap to spring. I lifted my glass, met her eyes, and pretended to sip. The wine never touched my lips. Funny thing about war, the battlefield isn't always halfway across the world. Sometimes it's sitting across from you, smiling like family. If you believe survival is more than bullets and bombs, stay with me. Like, subscribe, and listen close, because this mission was never in any manual. The first rule they drilled into us in CID was simple: observe before you react. It had saved my life in places where reaction time was measured in the width of a trigger pull. Tonight it would save me again, though the threat didn't wear a uniform or carry a weapon. It wore perfume and a smile. My hand rested on the stem of the wine glass, the cool crystal slick beneath my fingertips. I didn't blink, didn't look directly at the waiter, just a small nod. Enough for him to know I had heard. His eyes held mine for half a heartbeat before he turned away, steady and professional. Good soldier. I taught him well, even if he didn't remember my name. Across the table, Dylan was still talking, his hands moving in wide, animated arcs. He'd always been the storyteller, the charmer. Vanessa sat beside him, her red nails tracing lazy circles on the rim of her glass, the same color as her dress, the same color that now looked like a warning sign I had ignored for years. I forced a smile, let the noise of the restaurant wash over me, plates clinking, a saxophone sighing somewhere near the bar, ordinary sounds for an ordinary night. Inside, my pulse slowed to that familiar rhythm. Assess, plan, execute. I shifted slightly, tilting the glass as if admiring the wine. The surface rippled just enough to blur my reflection, a swirl of garnet hiding something darker beneath. "Excuse me," I said lightly. "Work never really ends, does it?" I reached for my phone, pretending to check a message, and rose from my seat. Vanessa flashed that polite social smile people wear when they're relieved you're leaving the table. Dylan nodded, distracted, already glancing toward the dessert menu. I walked toward the back hall near the restrooms. In the mirror lining the corridor, I could see our table reflected in the glass wall of the dining area. Evan. The waiter was clearing a nearby table, giving me a subtle glance. I lifted my napkin as if wiping my lipstick, then caught his eye again. He hesitated only a second before understanding. When he passed my table, he bent down, switching the wine glass in front of my empty chair with one from his tray. The motion was seamless, hidden beneath the practiced rhythm of service. Years of field training had taught me that the most dangerous moves were the quiet ones. I stayed in the hallway longer than I needed to, counting down the seconds. Vanessa leaned closer to Dylan, whispering something. He laughed. She laughed too, the kind of laugh that used to sound warm but now scraped against my nerves. When I returned, nothing had changed except the position of the glasses. Mine now in front of her, hers clean and safe, waiting for me. I sat down. "Everything okay?" Dylan asked, glancing at my phone. "Work stuff, always," I said. "You know how it is." I reached for my glass but didn't drink. My throat felt tight. I watched Vanessa lift hers. Watched the crimson liquid kiss the rim before she took a sip. For a second I thought I saw a surprise flicker in her eyes, then she smiled again. Maybe she thought the bitterness was from the wine. Conversation drifted back to safe topics. Vacations, real estate, how Dylan's gym was struggling after the economy tanked. He kept looking at me the way men look when they're calculating a favor but trying to hide it under affection. I knew that look. I'd seen it on informants. Suspects in the faces of soldiers who wanted out of trouble. The waiter passed again, pouring water, his expression neutral. When his sleeve brushed my shoulder, he murmured, barely audible, "Switch complete." I gave a small nod, my heart beat steady. Vanessa reached across the table, her bracelets clinking softly. "We should all do something together soon. Maybe Napa. You could use a break, Sarah." I smiled. Maybe. My mind was already elsewhere. Running through possibilities, the drink, the motive, the method. In the military, everything has intent, nothing is random. The dinner stretched on, each minute sharp as glass. I kept my breathing even, my words measured. If they sensed even a flicker of suspicion, I'd lose the advantage. Dylan talked about a business deal gone south. Vanessa added polite sympathy. I let them believe I was still the sister they remembered, the one who trusted too easily. When dessert came, I declined, claiming an early morning meeting. Vanessa looked faintly disappointed. Dylan stood to hug me, his arms warm, his cologne familiar. "We should catch up more," he said. His tone was light, but his eyes searched mine, restless. Guilt leaves fingerprints in the eyes if you know where to look. I stepped outside into the cool Virginia night. The air smelled of rain and asphalt, the kind of scent that wakes old memories of tarmac and tents. Evan appeared by the door. Still carrying his tray, I caught his sleeve before he turned back in. "Do you remember Fort Bragg?" I asked. His eyes widened slightly. "M. Sergeant Dean," he whispered. Recognition dawned, followed by respect. "Yes, ma'am, you trained our unit on interrogation protocols." "Good memory." I lowered my voice. "That woman in red, did you see her pour it?" He nodded once. "She used her napkin to hide it, something small from her clutch. I almost thought I imagined it." "You didn't." I slipped a folded bill into his hand, not for silence, but gratitude. "You just saved someone's life." He swallowed hard. "Are you okay?" "I will be." I walked to my car, every step deliberate. Under the soft streetlights, the world looked normal again. Normal was an illusion. I placed the napkin I'd used under the car's dome light. A faint ring of red shimmered against the white fabric. I sealed it in a plastic evidence bag from the small kit I always kept in the glove compartment. Old habits die hard. As I drove home, my mind worked through the pattern like a mission brief. Why now? Why this way? If the dose was small enough to mimic a medical episode, it meant they wanted plausible deniability. A fainting spell, a hospital stay, access to my accounts while I was sedated or worse. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was strategy. The road blurred ahead, headlights slicing through mist. My phone buzzed with a message from Dylan. "Great dinner, glad we're reconnecting." My thumb hovered over the screen, and I locked it without replying. Words were weapons too, and timing was everything. At home, the silence pressed close, thick and heavy. I poured the wine sample into a small vial from my field kit, labeling it with the date and time. Then I placed it in the refrigerator next to a carton of milk and a half-eaten apple. The contrast made me smile grimly. Civilian life, neat and ordinary, sitting beside evidence of attempted murder. In the reflection of the kitchen window, my own eyes looked back at me, calm, calculating. 10 years in service, countless interrogations, 2 deployments. Nothing prepared you for betrayal from blood, yet part of me had always known the battlefield would find its way home eventually. The next morning, I would send the sample to a contact still working in the military medical labs. Tonight, I would sleep lightly, the way soldiers do when the perimeter feels wrong. If you're listening, remember this. Danger doesn't always come kicking down your door. Sometimes it sits across from you, offering a toast. I barely slept. Habit kept me alert even when my eyes were closed. Every sound in the townhouse seemed louder than usual. The tick of the kitchen clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of settling wood. Years of sleeping in tents or safe houses had trained my body to respond to quiet as if it were gunfire. Stillness meant something was waiting. At dawn, I sat on the porch with a mug of black coffee. The street was calm, pale mist rising from the asphalt. I replayed the dinner again in my head, the moment Vanessa's hand moved, the waiter's warning, Dylan's nervous laugh. I watched each detail like a surveillance tape. In the field, we called it a mental after-action review. You don't look for what went wrong, you look for what didn't fit. The way Vanessa touched Dylan's arm when she thought no one noticed. The way he avoided eye contact whenever money came up. Those small tells stacked up like puzzle pieces. Family dinners should feel familiar. That one had felt staged. I finished my coffee and opened my laptop. The old CID instincts clicked in. I composed a short encrypted message to a contact in Fort Detrick's toxicology lab, a man who owed me a favor. I told him I had a sample from a client situation. He didn't need details. In this world, discretion is its own currency. I sealed the vial in a padded envelope, added a note requesting a full spectrum analysis. I'd get results within 48 hours if he still worked like he used to. Until then, patience. The hardest virtue for soldiers who were trained to act fast. By mid-morning, Dylan called. His name blinked across the screen. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hey sis, just checking you got home safe." "I did, thanks for dinner." My voice sounded steady, practiced. "You seemed quiet last night." "Long week," I said. There was a pause, long enough to feel his hesitation. "Vanessa felt bad you had to leave early. She really wanted you to try the dessert." I smiled into the phone, though he couldn't see it. "Next time." When the call ended, I stared at the phone for a long time. His tone was too careful, like someone stepping around broken glass. I spent the afternoon cleaning my gun, even though I didn't need to. The routine calmed my hands, gave them purpose. The smell of oil and metal grounded me, reminded me who I was before all the family dinners and polite betrayals. Out there, trust was simple. You earned it or you didn't. At home, it came wrapped in sentiment and expectation. Late that evening, I drove to a self-storage unit on the edge of town. Inside, under a canvas tarp, sat my old field trunk from service days. I hadn't opened it in years. Dust coated the latches, but the key still fit. Inside were files, medals, an old pair of boots, and a portable UV scanner I'd used for counterfeit detection. I pulled it out, plugged it into the lighter socket of my car, and examined the napkin again. Under ultraviolet light, faint streaks glowed pale blue along the wine stain, residue consistent with crushed tablets. Whoever did it wasn't sloppy. They knew how to hide it. I sat there a long time, the hum of fluorescent lights above mixing with the low murmur of passing traffic. My pulse was slow, but my mind moved fast. What was the motive? Money, always the obvious answer. But why risk something so extreme when simple deceit could do? Unless desperation had replaced reason. Back home, I opened the file labeled Operation Glass Rose. The name had come to me the moment I saw Vanessa's glass catch the light, beauty hiding fragility. I typed out my observations, timeline, behaviors, physical evidence, witness. The discipline of documentation gave the chaos a shape I could handle. The next evening, a message pinged from my contact at Fort Detrick. Preliminary results, beta blocker compound. High dosage, possible cardiac impact when combined with alcohol. I exhaled slowly. Confirmation brought clarity, not comfort. I printed the report, slid it into a folder, and tucked it inside the hollow back of a photo frame on my desk. In the picture, Dylan and I stood in front of our parents' house years ago, grinning after my first deployment. I studied the younger versions of us, the pride in his eyes, the dirt on my uniform. The innocence we both mistook for permanence. The next few days passed in quiet routine. I went for runs at dawn, checked messages, met clients who still sought my advice on security systems. Outwardly, everything looked normal. Inside, I was tracing a map of betrayal with every breath. Friday evening, Vanessa called. Her tone was bright, rehearsed. "Sarah, we're having a few friends over tomorrow. Casual dinner. You should come. Dylan misses you." I hesitated just long enough to sound natural. "I'll think about it." "Please do. It would mean a lot." When I hung up, I stared at the phone again. The invitation wasn't peace, it was reconnaissance. She wanted to see if I suspected. Fine, let her watch. I'd been trained to play that game. That night, I visited Evan at the restaurant. He was closing up, stacking chairs onto tables. "You sure you're safe?" he asked. "I'm sure," I said, "but I need a favor." He nodded. "Anything. I need the footage from last night's camera, angle facing our table." He hesitated. "That might get me fired." "I'll make sure it doesn't, and I'll make sure you're compensated." He looked at me for a long moment, then disappeared into the back. 10 minutes later, he returned with a flash drive. "You didn't get this from me." Understood. Back in my car, I plugged the drive into my laptop. The video was grainy but clear enough. There it was, Vanessa lifting her napkin, her hand dipping toward my glass, the swift motion of her wrist. My jaw tightened, but I forced myself to keep watching. Evidence first, emotions later. When I stopped the playback, the screen reflected my face, expressionless. Years ago, I'd interrogated men who'd blown up convoys, who justified cruelty as duty. I'd always believed evil had a look to it, but betrayal looked ordinary. It smiled. It said please and thank you. It wore red lipstick. I spent the next hour composing a plan. I wouldn't confront them yet. I'd document verify, then decide how to dismantle the threat without becoming them. Vengeance was easy, justice required control. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, the kind that promised summer rain. I stepped out onto the balcony and let the first drops hit my face. In another life, I'd have been asleep under a tarp somewhere in a desert, counting down hours till sunrise. Now the war was quiet, but the enemy was personal. I thought about Dylan again, about the kid who used to follow me around in his baseball cap, asking if he could hold my medals, about the way our parents had compared us, always telling him to be more like his sister. Maybe resentment had grown roots in that shadow. Maybe Vanessa had watered them. The rain grew heavier, blurring the lights of the city below. I whispered to the darkness, more to myself than anyone. You should have known better, Dylan. You should have known who taught you to survive. The next morning, I packed the evidence neatly into a secure lockbox. The napkin, the lab report, the video copy, the phone logs. Each piece is a chapter in a story they didn't know I was writing. I placed it inside the trunk in the closet, behind old uniforms that still smelled faintly of sand and sweat. That night, I drove past their house. The lights were on, laughter spilling from the windows. For a moment, I wanted to believe it was still the same family, that nothing had changed. But truth doesn't care about nostalgia. It waits in the dark until you have the courage to face it. I parked at the end of the street, engine off, and watched the silhouettes move behind the curtains. Dylan pouring drinks. Vanessa handed him a glass. My stomach turned. I could almost taste the bitterness she'd intended for me. In the rearview mirror, my reflection stared back, calm, unreadable. This wasn't rage, it was purpose. I had the evidence, the motive, the method. All that was left was timing. When I finally drove away, the rain had stopped. Streetlights reflected off puddles like shards of glass scattered across the asphalt. In the military, hesitation gets you killed. That night, it got me thinking. If you've ever trusted the wrong person, you already know the lesson. The battlefield doesn't always end when the war does. Sometimes it follows you home and waits for you to open the door. The rain had stopped by morning, but the sky still carried that gray weight that makes you feel the storm hasn't really gone anywhere. It just went quiet, like a soldier catching his breath. I brewed coffee, black and bitter, and laid out my field kit on the kitchen table. The tools looked out of place in a civilian home, a sterile vial, a dropper, a compact chemical test strip, but routine steadies the nerves. The napkin, still sealed in plastic, waited under the light. I cut a small square from the stained corner and placed it on the plate. A few drops of distilled water brought the color back to life. The liquid turned faintly cloudy. I touched the strip to it, watching the edges bloom a pale shade of blue. The reading confirmed what I already knew deep down: beta blockers, high concentration, too much for coincidence. I noted the result in my logbook and sat back. The test wasn't perfect, but I had seen enough of these readings in field cases to know what it meant. A dose that strong, mixed with alcohol, would have dropped my blood pressure fast. Maybe just a fainting spell at first, then cardiac arrest before anyone realized it wasn't natural. The kind of thing that looks like bad luck. I had seen that trick in investigations overseas, except those had been done by professionals. I stared at the blue mark until it faded, thinking of Vanessa's steady hands and calm voice. She had done her homework. Someone had supplied her, someone who understood dosage and timing. But it wasn't the science that unsettled me. It was easy. The casualness of pouring death into a glass between small talk and laughter. The clock on the wall ticked softly. The world outside looked normal again. But once you know someone wants you gone, normal disappears forever. I turned to the laptop. If motive followed money, I'd find the trail there. Years in CID had taught me that crimes of greed leave the same footprints: debt, lies, desperate transfers between accounts. I logged into my credit reports, then the monitoring service I used for my company's sale. It didn't take long. 2 recent hard inquiries I didn't recognize. One from a private lender in Nevada, another from a shell finance group out of Miami. I cross-checked the application numbers. The borrower name wasn't mine, but the social security number was, and the co-signer's name, Dylan. My throat went dry. I opened another browser window and searched public filings. The numbers aligned with a commercial loan secured against a failing gym franchise in Virginia Beach. $2.7 million, signed 3 months ago, repayment already in default. My hands were steady as I scrolled through the digital paperwork. The signature at the bottom looked close enough to mine to fool a bank clerk. Not perfect, but good. Vanessa had probably forged it. She'd worked in real estate years ago, good enough with forms to make fiction believable. I leaned back in the chair, the old ache pressing behind my eyes. Betrayal rarely comes as a single act. It's a slow erosion, small lies building until the foundation gives way. Maybe this had been building for years and I just refused to see it. The kettle clicked off. I poured another cup, the smell of roasted beans filling the room. I remembered Dylan as a kid, chasing fireflies in the backyard while I polished my boots before training camp. He used to wait for me at the bus stop when I came home on leave, eyes bright with pride. I had carried that memory like armor, but maybe it had rusted without me noticing. I clicked through social media, scanning Dylan's posts, photos of the gym's grand opening last year, ribbons, smiles, investors, Vanessa at his side, sleek and ambitious. Then 3 months later, the update stopped. The comments turned anxious. Words like restructuring, delays, market crash. And then silence. I opened the business registry next. The company was listed under both their names, assets minimal, liabilities high. When I clicked the additional guarantor tab, there it was again, my name. A low laugh escaped me, not out of humor but disbelief. They hadn't just tried to steal, they'd tried to bury me under their debts. Kill the signature, claim the estate, clean slate. The soldier in me didn't flare with rage, it calculated. Anger wastes time. Strategy wins wars. I began to outline possibilities. Report it to the police. Too soon. Without proof of intent, they'd say it was identity theft, maybe a mix-up. And if I accused my family, it would go public. My company's sale was still fresh. Investors and partners would smell scandal. No, this had to be handled quietly, surgically. I created a new encrypted folder on my desktop, naming it Operation Glass Rose. Inside, I saved copies of every document, screenshot, and bank record. I labeled the subfolders evidence, motive, method. The organization soothed me. A mission needs order. By evening, I had gathered enough to know the pattern. A desperate couple bleeding money, a failing business, and the illusion that killing one person could fix it all. Classic financial spiral. But what struck me hardest wasn't their greed. It was their certainty that I wouldn't fight back. That night, I sat by the window as the last light drained from the sky. Across the street, a family laughed over dinner, their shadows flickering against the blinds. I wondered if Dylan and Vanessa were eating too. Maybe clinking glasses again, congratulating themselves on a near miss. The part of me that once believed in redemption wanted to drive there, confront them, demand an explanation. The soldier in me knew better. You don't walk into an ambush twice. Instead, I called Renee Coleman, my old friend and former FBI liaison. She answered on the second ring, her voice rough with fatigue. "Sarah, it's been years. Too many," I said. "I need your help off the record." Her tone sharpened. "You in trouble?" "Not yet," I said, "but someone wants me to be." There was a pause long enough for old trust to settle back into place. "Come by tomorrow, early." When the call ended, I looked down at my hands. The faint ink smudge from signing the company's sale papers still marked my finger. I rubbed it away. Funny how ink and blood can both stain without showing right away. I closed the laptop. The folder glowing faintly on the desktop like a small, silent promise. They wanted me gone. I wanted the truth exposed. The difference was I had training, and this time I wasn't fighting for a flag or a mission brief. I was fighting for the quiet, stubborn right to live. If you think betrayal only happens in stories, think again. Sometimes the war doesn't find you. Sometimes it's born in your own bloodline. Renee's house sat on the edge of Quantico, a quiet single-story place that still looked like a federal agent lived there, neat, secure, and a little too watchful. Cameras tucked under the eaves, motion lights that clicked on the second I stepped out of my car. She opened the door before I could knock twice. Her gray hair was shorter now, but her eyes hadn't changed. Sharp, assessing, tired. "Sarah Dean," she said, and for a moment the corners of her mouth softened. "You look the same." "I look like someone who hasn't slept," I said. "Then you look exactly like every agent I ever respected." She led me inside. The place smelled like coffee and old books. A framed commendation from the bureau hung over the mantel, half hidden behind a stack of unopened mail. She poured 2 mugs of coffee and gestured toward the kitchen table, where a laptop, folders, and a Glock shared the same space with yesterday's newspaper. "Tell me everything," she said. I laid out the facts in order: the dinner, the switch, the waiter's warning, the test results, the forged loan papers. She didn't interrupt, just nodded slowly, tapping her pen against the table every time something didn't sit right. When I finished, she leaned back, exhaling. Are you sure about the compound? Metoprolol, high dose, confirmed by a lab contact. And the loan, filed under my SSN, Dylan as co-signer. She shook her head. That's not garden variety fraud, that's planned. And if the drug connects, it's attempted homicide with premeditation. You could take this to law enforcement right now. I could, I said, but that would blow it open. The media would circle, investors would pull back. I'd spend a year explaining why my family tried to kill me instead of moving on. So you want this quiet. I want it contained. Renee studied me for a long moment, then smiled faintly. You always did have a taste for clean operations. Fine, let's start where you'd start if this were a case file. We spent the next hour building a digital map, financial records, phone numbers, social links. Renee's old bureau login still opened doors most civilians couldn't touch. She pulled data like she was still on payroll. Within minutes, the outlines of Dylan and Vanessa's life unfolded across the screen, accounts draining faster than they filled, credit cards maxed, a luxury car recently repossessed. The gym was closed for renovations. Their address had changed twice in 6 months. Renee zoomed in on one particular transfer, $50,000 wired from an account under Vanessa's name to something called Viridian Consulting. You know this company? No, I said. Neither do I, but it's registered in Delaware. No physical office, no employees listed. Classic shell. She clicked through a few more links, her eyes narrowing. The same entity received transfers from 2 other small businesses, one in Phoenix, one in Tampa, both dissolved last year. So she's laundering money, I said quietly, or someone's helping her hide it. The old rhythm came back between us, 2 investigators falling into the familiar cadence of suspicion and proof. It was almost comforting, like slipping into a uniform again, except this time the target wore my brother's face. Renee turned off the monitor. You said there was a waiter. Can we trust him? He's a veteran, trained under me at Fort Bragg, solid kid. Get a statement, even unofficial. If we have eyewitness corroboration, we can lean harder if this escalates. I nodded, already forming the plan in my head. She poured more coffee. You know, she said quietly, the hardest part of cases like this isn't the evidence. It's the moment you realize love doesn't protect you. Are you still okay? I stared into the cup. I've been okay in worse places. She reached across the table and touched my wrist, brief but firm. I don't believe that, but you'll get there. By the time I left her house, the day had stretched into a pale winter afternoon. I drove back to Arlington with the kind of focus that comes from anger you won't admit you're feeling. Back home, I called Evan. He picked up on the second ring. Evan, it's Sarah Dean. Yes, ma'am. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Of course. When you saw her pour it, did my brother see? He hesitated. He was looking at the menu, but after she poured it, she looked at him and nodded. My grip tightened on the phone. Thank you, that's all I needed. I still have the security copy, he added. The manager deletes files every week. I kept yours separate, just in case. Good man, keep it safe. If anyone asks, say nothing. When I hung up, the pieces started clicking into place. Vanessa might have planned the act, but Dylan had given consent. Maybe he hadn't touched the vial, but silence can be a complicity. I spent the evening drafting a detailed report in the Operation Glass Rose folder. I wrote it the way I'd write a mission brief: objective, threat, resources, counteraction. It steadied me. The structure of procedure wrapped chaos in clarity. Halfway through, I paused and stared at the header. Operation Glass Rose, the name still fit, something fragile, beautiful, and deadly if broken. As night deepened, my house filled with that restless quiet that only comes when you're thinking too much. I stood at the window, city lights flickering below, and wondered how long Dylan and Vanessa had been plotting. Did it start when I sold the company, when they saw the transfer hit my account, or had the resentment been simmering long before, waiting for the right excuse? Memory plays cruel tricks. I remembered Dylan at our parents' funeral, gripping my hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. He'd whispered that we only had each other now. Maybe that was true once, but grief can twist love into something unrecognizable. My phone buzzed with a new message, a photo from an unknown number. It was my house, taken from across the street. The caption read, "You should get better curtains." My heart didn't race, it narrowed. Fear is a reflex, training is a choice. I dimmed the lights, moved to the back door, and peered through the peephole. The street looked empty. But shadows had a way of lying. I called Renee. They're watching me. How do you know? They sent proof. Get out for tonight. I'll send someone to sweep the place. No, I said, I'll handle it. She sighed. Of course you will. You always did hate backups. I hung up and opened the closet. My go bag was still there, packed the way it had been since my service days: clean clothes, burner phone, Glock 19, small med kit. I locked the evidence in a safe bolted under the floorboards. Then I sat in the dark living room, gun resting on my knee, waiting for movement. Hours passed, nothing. But sometimes the waiting is its own kind of war. When dawn came, exhaustion hit like recoil. I showered, dressed, and drove to a coffee shop downtown. Public places make good cover. Too many eyes, too much light. From there, I checked my accounts again. A new withdrawal alert flashed on my phone: $20,000 from an old joint savings account Dylan and I had shared years ago. I'd forgotten it even existed. He hadn't. I called the bank immediately, reporting unauthorized access. They froze the funds, a small victory, but victories matter when the front line is invisible. By the time I returned home, Renee had sent me a secure file. Inside were screenshots from her bureau contacts, Vanessa's name tied to a flagged account in Delaware, the same shell company, Viridian Consulting. Transactions traced back to a broker connected with black market pharmaceuticals. There it was, the supplier, the poison, the motive. I printed the file, clipped it to the growing folder labeled Operation Glass Rose, and placed it on the table. The evidence was nearly complete. Outside, the morning light broke through thin clouds, washing the room in gold. For a brief second, everything looked peaceful. Then my phone vibrated again, another message. This one had no picture, just a line of text. Dinner was lovely. Next time, don't bring friends. I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I laughed softly, the sound hollow. They thought intimidation would make me retreat. They didn't understand. I'd faced worse in deserts where the air itself wanted you dead. I picked up the file and whispered to no one in particular. You just confirmed the next phase. The war had changed, but the rules were the same: identify, isolate, neutralize. As the sun rose higher, I locked the door, loaded my weapon, and felt the calm return. Every mission has a turning point. I had just reached mine. If you're listening, remember this: courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's just the sound of a soldier breathing steady in the dark, waiting for dawn and planning the next move. The moment I decided to go offensive, something of me shifted. It was not bravado. It was the same quiet calibration that kept soldiers alive under fire. You do not rush, you prepare, you close gaps, you name the mission. Operation Glass Rose sat like a small stone on my desktop, the words deliberate and neat. Renee lived by rules a lot of people thought outdated. Never meet in predictable places. Always assume someone is watching. Keep a burner. And never leave evidence in a single place. She had a way of making the old bureau protocols feel less like paranoia and more like good housekeeping. Her living room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner when I walked in, everything intentionally in its place. She poured coffee as if pouring patience, and then she opened her laptop and started pulling threads. We worked like surgeons, each motion practiced and economical. I handed her the summary. She did not ask for theatrics. Evidence first, inference later. She ran the shell company numbers through a database only someone with federal access could touch. Viridian Consulting showed up like a ghost in the system, registered in Delaware, no office, routing through accounts in Florida and Nevada. The money trail crisscrossed small businesses that had folded overnight, funnels designed by people who knew how to disappear records. Money laundering thinly veiled. We planned a meeting that would serve two purposes. First, to provoke a reaction from Dylan without looking like the accused. Second, to place a credible third party between Dylan and Vanessa so that when we presented evidence, we did so from a position of authority and not family rancor. Renee suggested we hire an independent firm to pose as interested investors. The firm would ask questions, request documentation, and subtly press for guarantees. People with something to hide reveal themselves when they think help is close. I made calls that night, not cold ones. Old contacts answer differently when you have a past. The independent auditor I found had once overseen physical audits for a defense contractor. He knew how to keep things off the record. He agreed tentatively to send an associate to a recorded yet informal lunch. We scripted nothing. We wanted to see how they would behave when given the prospect of money that could fix a drowning business. We rehearsed the meeting like a mission brief: objective, constraints, risks, exit strategies. Renee and I ran through contingencies. If they tried to flee, if they involved counsel, if Vanessa recorded or tried to weaponize a claim of harassment. We planned neutral language, plausible reasons for the inquiry, and a credible front of interested capital. My role was the witness, the injured party, the sister who wanted to facilitate a solution. Renee would be the discreet advisor with inquiries that cut through polite lies. The auditor would play his part as a no-nonsense professional with a legal pad and an unblinking stare. On the day, the restaurant felt different, smaller. It was the kind of place that curled into itself, private booths and dim lighting that makes secrets sound softer. Dylan walked in first, shoulders broad in the way men try to appear when they feel small inside. Vanessa followed, composed. The same red dress that had once made me laugh at its audacity, now making my skin close like a healed wound. They sat with the easy arrogance of people who believed in their story. The auditor arrived third, unassuming in a gray blazer, a man who looked like he would ask for receipts and accept no excuses. Renee took a spot at the far end of the table, half reading a file, half listening. I sat like someone ready to be grateful for help, moving my glass so it never touched my lips but always looked as though it might. We opened with small talk, the kind that softens suspicion into conversation. The auditor asked about the gym and cash flow under the vague pretense of market research. Dylan volunteered numbers that were more optimistic than the filings. Vanessa smiled, said that setbacks were a normal part of scaling. Their tone was rehearsed, polite, tidy. People who are laundering often speak in the language of optimism to hide panic. At one point, as the auditor leaned forward and asked about guarantees, I watched Dylan's fingers. They drummed a rhythm he must have thought invisible. When the auditor asked about collateral, Vanessa answered calmly that Sarah was a valued partner and that any further assurances could be negotiated. I felt the air shift. That word partner carried weight. They had used my name as a shield. Now they were rehearsing how to use it to extract more. Renee's question came quietly and clean. So, who currently holds the guarantees on the loans underwriting the expansion? Another way to put it, who is the legal co-signer on the financials? The auditor's pen paused. Dylan answered too quickly, almost guileless. It was a slip, the kind people make when their script is interrupted. Vanessa's phone buzzed. She glanced down, then back up, smiling as if nothing had happened. Her thumb moved in a language familiar to anyone who uses a phone to hide the real world. It was then that I noted context. Her messages came in short bursts, redacted texts designed to look like business updates. I watched, too, the way a tracker watches a target, learning patterns. After lunch, the auditor suggested some due diligence, a background check, typical and expected. We moved the conversation gently into terms that would require documentation that they did not have. If Dylan had forged signatures, he would try to stall. If he had been honest, he would welcome the transparency. People who manufacture lies hesitate under evidence. Driving home, I felt the heaviness of the day press into my chest. We had not accused, but we had pried. We had placed a mirror and watched them look at it. My phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number, a photo of my front porch. The same ugly warning as before. Whoever it was wanted me to know they could see me. Whoever it was wanted me to be afraid. Fear is a tool. I will not pretend it does not cut, but in the calculus of action, fear can be converted into data. The message told me two things. They were either sloppy or they wanted me to know. Sloppiness gives you edges to exploit. Intimidation gives you insight into character. Both are useful. That evening, Renee and I reviewed the recorded conversation. Evan had slipped us an extra camera angle. The recording showed Vanessa making a call in the bathroom and whispering a phrase I had heard only once before in interrogation rooms, that casual businesslike tone used when arranging something criminal. She said the words she owes us. We handle it in a way that looks like fate. The prosecutor and me cataloged the phrase. It was evidence of intent delivered without rage. We laid out the next moves. First, corroborate the shell company ownership with a paper trail. Delaware filings have loopholes, but they leave searchable fingerprints if you know where to look. Second, tighten the financial freezes. Contact the banks quietly and mark any suspicious movements. Third, protect myself physically and digitally. Change routines, rotate drivers, use cash or supervised transactions. Last set the stage for a controlled confrontation where the truth could be presented in a way that made escape impossible and justified leverage without public spectacle. The week blurred into logistics. Renee leaned on old colleagues for quiet holds, placing gentle legal probes that would make banks pause without broadcasting scandal. I called my attorney, a retired JAG officer who owed me a favor. He agreed to draft safe letters and set up escrow arrangements that could be activated if necessary. My legal team was small, efficient, and discretionary. This was not about theatrics. This was about precise pressure. One night, in the quiet between tasks, I found an old letter from our mother in a drawer. She had written about resilience, about how families sometimes break in ways you cannot heal. I read it twice, then left it on the table like a small monument. The letter mattered because it was proof that history was real, that we had shared a past that needed no jury to validate it. But the past does not excuse present betrayal. On a cold morning, my bank called with a verification. Someone had attempted to move assets from an account the couple had access to. The bank had frozen the transfers pending additional verification. My pulse gave an involuntary tremor of satisfaction. The probes were working. They were nuddling, tightening. And the difference between panic and calculation was becoming visible on their faces in the videos Evan provided. We were ready for the next stage. I would arrange a meeting, a neutral office with witnesses and legal counsel present under the guise of finalizing a family investment trust. They would come expecting praise, perhaps some official-looking paperwork. Instead, they would be presented with a dossier that could not be denied. We were not out to humiliate them. We were out to force a choice that would protect my name and my assets and keep the scandal out of the press. Vulnerability had never been my currency. If you are following this closely, know this: retribution is not the only path to justice. Sometimes containment and correction are the larger victories. If you value quiet strategy over public spectacle, there is a lesson in patience. Press like if you value tactics over theatrics, and I will keep you in the loop for what comes next. We rehearsed the meeting the way soldiers rehearse a breach. Each role had lines, but the truth was our script. The auditor would sit slightly to the right, an independent presence. Renee would sit across with sealed documents. I would be the small, grateful sister. Dylan and Vanessa would be given every chance to choose the easier path. The room would be neutral, professional, and recorded. The evening before the meeting, I packed a small kit: evidence copies in sealed envelopes, backup drives measuring chain of custody, a portable recorder, legally admissible affidavits pre-drafted and ready. I put the folder into the trunk of my car and went to bed as if nothing special were about to happen. Sleep came with the practiced exhaustion of a soldier who knows waking is inevitable. Morning came with no fanfare, but I felt a quiet resolve that steadied the hands of a woman who had been through firefights and courtrooms and still wanted only to keep living. The day ahead would not be the end of everything, but it would be a pivot. We would take control of the narrative by controlling the facts. In the world I had inhabited for years, truth and timing are weapons. In the civilian world, timing is a kind of mercy. We would use both. The conference room smelled faintly of lemon and printer toner, ordinary things that do not belong in a place where lives change. The table was long and polished, the skyline a wall of glass behind me. I had chosen neutral, clinical surroundings on purpose. No home, no church, nothing that invited theatrics. Our people arrived early and took their places like trained extras. Renee sat to my right, the auditor to my left. Two discreet investigators in the corner with folders and quiet eyes. A lockbox sat on the sideboard for phones, and the receptionist had been given a simple script to manage interruptions. Everything looked routine. Everything was a lie. Dylan and Vanessa arrived a few minutes late, as if timing could still grant them dignity. Dylan walked in with his shoulders squared, Vanessa with the same practiced smile, but now it looked brittle. They seated themselves across from me as if the room were the living room and we were having a family chat. Politeness has a way of sounding like admission when the truth waits in a folder. We began with small talk, the kind that eases a knife into soft meat. Renee opened a dummy packet of trust documents, signed with bland legalese, and asked for acknowledgement pages. Dylan and Vanessa obliged, their pens light and practiced. The auditor asked a few questions about the gym, feigning interest as he took notes. They answered with confident phrases they had rehearsed at home. People in trouble learned to speak in slogans to cover fright. When the moment arrived, Renee leaned forward, palms flat on the table, and spoke in a voice that gave no space for drama but allowed zero confusion. She produced the first envelope and slid it across to them. Inside was a printout of the toxicology result. Stamped, signed, chain of custody logged. The paper sat between us like a verdict. Vanessa's expression barely twitched, as if she had been taught not to let a single emotion leak. Dylan's throat worked. He cleared it and said something about mistakes, about pressure, about bad investments. His words were a patchwork of excuses. Renee let him speak until the sound of his own voice began to reveal contradictions. Next came the video. Evan had couriered a copy, and we played it on a tablet with an external speaker quietly muted, so only the table could hear the subtle noises. There she was, Vanessa, lifting her napkin, tipping something small into my glass, a motion almost invisible until the camera frame caught the sleeve, the wrist, the turn. The recording was not cinematic. It was mundane, incriminating in its ordinariness. Dylan looked away. Vanessa stared at the screen as if watching a performance of someone else's life. Then I played the audio clip, the one Renee had isolated from a background recording. Vanessa's voice, calm and practical, saying she would make it look like fate. "You owe us," she had said, "and we take care of it." The words landed like iron. I watched them for the tell I had learned to read in gun camps and interrogation rooms. Vanessa's left hand, the one that tapped her glass, trembled. Dylan's jaw clenched so hard his knuckles blanched. The performance was unraveling at the seams. Renee placed another file on the table. Bank records, transfers, shell company filings. The paper trail moved like a map across the surface, following money from accounts in Florida to a consulting firm in Delaware, and onward to small businesses that were now closed. There was the loan application, my social security number clearly attached, Dylan listed as co-signer. The signature looked good enough to pass in a noisy bank lobby, but the forensics print showed the stroke pressure inconsistent with mine. Forensic handwriting analysts have a way of turning confidence into embarrassment. They started to speak at once, voices overlapping into a chorus of denial. Vanessa said she never wanted to hurt me, that she had panicked. Dylan said it had been a mistake, an impulsive choice born of desperation. Renee let them flail. The investigators handed over a copy of the affidavit Evan had signed quietly the morning after the dinner. It was concise, factual, direct. He described what he had seen and the look Vanessa gave when she thought no one noticed. The affidavit was a witness statement given without coercion, and it cut like a clean blade. I kept my face neutral. Emotions are weaknesses if offered too soon. I wanted them to reveal themselves without me raising my voice. I wanted them to fall into their own culpability. Instead, Dylan tried bargaining. He offered to refinance, to sign documents, to transfer property. He said he would do whatever it took to make things right. I had heard those promises before in war zones and in courtrooms. They are cheap and useless unless backed by enforceable action. Renee reached into her folder and placed the final document on the table. A draft settlement agreement, carefully worded, balanced legally but firm in outcome. It was elegant, surgical. No cameras outside, no public filings unless the agreement were breached. The terms were simple. They would relinquish any claim to my estate or company assets. They would sign an immediate transfer of any items sold or promised using my identity. They would consent to a permanent legal separation from any financial ties that could touch me, and would agree to confidentiality and monitored escrow. In return, I would not, at that moment, hand the packet to the district attorney. The room seemed to tilt on a single axis, the choice a pivot between two worlds. One path meant public exposure, charged indictments, and the slow brutality of criminal discovery. The other meant containment, loss of wealth for them, and a quiet termination of their legal leverage over me. Both were justice. One was loud and messy, the other surgical. Vanessa looked at Dylan as if waiting for him to lead. He hesitated, the expression of someone who had always wanted to follow and now had to choose. He reached for the pen with a shaking hand, paper scratches as lives change. He signed. Vanessa's eyes brimmed with tears, and for a heartbeat I felt a flicker of the brother I used to know. Then she signed. The ink smeared where her fingers brushed the line, a physical manifestation of everything ugly and human. They signed while I sat still, my hands folded, my face the calm of someone who has calculated every risk. Renee clipped the pages together and slid them into a sealed envelope. She recorded the signing with a time-stamped camera that was uploaded to an escrow account. The investigators filed a chain of custody forms. Everything that mattered was now documented, audited, and secured. When it was over, Dylan looked at me with a kind of nakedness I had not seen since childhood. He said he was sorry and that he had been drowning. Vanessa's voice trembled, then hardened into the same defense she had used when investors criticized her plans. She said she had felt cornered and had made a choice she could not take back. I heard the confession and the plea and the self-justification. Human beings have many ways of saying the same thing. They can apologize without remorse. Renee closed the folder and set it aside. She spoke in the way the Bureau trains you to speak when you want to be heard and not hated. She explained the enforcement mechanisms, the escrow triggers, and the legal consequences if the agreement were violated. She did not wave threats. She explained the outcomes. That is often scarier than thunder. The room emptied with a different kind of quiet. There was no shouting, no dramatic exit, just small footsteps and a new arrangement of truth. Outside the glass, the city moved on, indifferent. Inside, we had redefined what it meant to be family, and there was no return to the past. After they left, I sat with the folder in front of me, the weight of what had been done settling like dust. I felt relief, yes, but it was not the exultant kind. It was the steady clearing of a path, the pragmatic closing of a danger that had been allowed to approach. There was no rejoicing, only the faint satisfaction of a mission accomplished without spectacle. Renee and I walked to the door as the receptionist stacked chairs behind us. She touched my arm in a gesture that was almost maternal and almost military. She said quietly that the DA would be ready if we needed prosecution, that the banks would watch accounts and freeze any funny movement, and that our escrow would hold the originals in a secure vault. She suggested a few public statements in the unlikely event of leakage, always neutral and short. She reminded me that containment requires vigilance. When I drove home, the city seemed oddly small, as if the actions that had felt enormous now fit into a hand. I parked in front of my house and sat for a moment, the folder at my side in the passenger seat. The rain from days before had rinsed the streets clean, but there was no washing away of what had happened. My phone buzzed with a single message from an unknown number. It read simply, "Next time we won't miss." The words should have shaken me back into fear, but they landed like a dull stone on a pond where ripples had already been measured. I walked inside, put the folder into the safe, and locked it. Then I sat at the kitchen table and poured a glass of water. The wine that had almost been mine weeks ago remained a memory. The battle was not over, not by a long shot, but we had the upper hand. Strategy had replaced chaos. In the weeks that followed, the legal mechanisms did their work. Banks froze suspect accounts. The escrow held the original documents. Our investigator monitored communications. Dylan and Vanessa moved through the world like people who had been stripped of something they had assumed would belong to them forever. Friends fell away. Creditors circled. They were not the only casualties. I had lost a brother to choices that would imprison him in regret and penance. Loss is not always about what you keep. Sometimes it is the cost of survival. Operation Glass Rose succeeded at its first objective. The immediate threat to my life and my assets was neutralized. But success is never a period. It is a comma, a breath, a preparation for what comes next. I knew that. Renee knew that. The investigator who handed me a sealed thumb drive with recorded evidence of the meeting said quietly that if they violated the terms, the DA would have everything they needed to indict on attempted murder. That knowledge was not vindictive. It was structurally safe. I slept that night with the window open and the city breathing around me. I thought about the woman I had become, not a hero in any public sense, but a difficult private person who refused to be erased. The world may tell you that family should protect you. Sometimes family is the first to turn its hands into weapons. When that happens, you treat them like any other threat. You document, you control, you act with discipline. If you value restraint as a tool for justice. Share this story and let others see that there are measured ways to survive betrayal without becoming what hurt you. The real victory is not the fall of those who wronged you. The real victory is how you rebuild what they tried to take. The conference room was all glass and muted light. a clean rectangle of decision where polite language could not hide intent. I had chosen the space because it felt official and impersonal, the kind of place where paper matters more than passion. My folder sat on the table like a small, deliberate proof. Inside were the pieces they could not unmake: toxicology, video, bank records, a signed witness statement. Evan had handed me his camera copy in a sealed envelope and said only that he had done what he could. That was enough. They arrived on time, trying to wear dignity as armor. Dylan still had the ease of a man who believed charm could clean mistakes. Vanessa moved with the assurance of someone used to getting appointments and signatures. For a long second, I let them take the stage. Acting weakness looks honest. People line over their scripts when they believe you are already given. We began with measured talk about logistics and trust. Renee read the room with the same steady gaze she brought to every file. The auditor sat with his pad, the investigators in the corner with quiet eyes. Phones were in a lock box, the only exception the recorder that sat facing us like a small, impartial judge. No theatrics, no speeches, only facts in a room arranged like an evidence locker. When I slid the first envelope across the table, the paper seemed to make a small sound against the polished wood, and I felt something unclench in my chest. The printout of the lab result lay on top, stamped and initialized. Beta blocker concentration, high dose, a blue mark of chemical intent in a neat box. The words on the page read like a cold sentence. I watched Vanessa fold her hands. Dylan's mouth opened, closed, and then opened again as if searching for a word that would stitch the moment back to ordinary life. He offered a story about pressure and failed investments. He spoke of late nights at the gym, of recruiters who promised capital and never delivered. Vanessa added the practice line about sacrifice and growth. Their voices were logical, tidy, the way people try to purchase absolution with explanations. I let them talk. Letting them fill the silence with excuses was part of the plan. Then Renee did something simple and final. She played the video. It was not cinematic. It was cheap camera footage, the kind of thing you assume misses the important bits until it does not. There, in the grainy frame, Vanessa moved like any woman reaching under her napkin. The tilt of the wrist, the small, unnoticeable motion into the glass, the return of the clutch into a purse. Ordinary gestures made criminal by intent. Silence fell thick and heavy. For a moment I expected shouting, the cinematic collapse of a family. Instead, Vanessa looked at the screen with a blankness I would later recognize as denial. Dylan's jaw worked. He had the stupid, stunned expression of a person who had just been shown his own shadow and did not like what he saw. We brought forward the bank files next. The map of transfers, the shell company routing through Delaware, the loan application with my identifying number attached. Evidence is patient. It waits. People who rely on schemes hope time will blur lines. Paper, however, remembers. The more we presented, the thinner their stories became. Vanessa tried to turn sentiment into defense. You would not let family starve, she said, her voice warm in a way that tried to make the world soft. Family does not poison your glass, I replied, quiet and precise. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. The silence did the rest. Dylan started to bargain, offering refinancing, property transfers, and promises of restitution. His words were a salve he obviously hoped would stick. Renee listened and then set a folder on the table. Inside was a settlement proposition written with legal care. It offered containment and consequence in equal measure. Relinquish any claim to estate and assets. Transfer any items sold under false pretense. Agree to monitor escrow and permanent separation from financial ties. Sign now and no public charges now. Violate the terms and the packet moves to the district attorney. I watched him sign. It was not a dramatic moment. It was a small, decisive one, the scratch of ink across paper that rearranges what we can take from each other. When Vanessa signed, her hand trembled enough to smear the ink. The human in her showed under the instructions she had rehearsed. They left with the envelope clipped and the knowledge that the file would sit in escrow, sealed and secure. After they departed, the room felt narrowed, ordered, as if whatever had been loose during that family life had finally been packed and boxed. Renee explained the mechanics in terms that had nothing to do with vengeance and everything to do with systems. The bank freezes. The escrow holds, the DA pipeline all exists as a contingency. I had not sought revenge. I had sought containment. The difference mattered. Driving home, the city looked ordinary and oddly small, as if the day's work had made it manageable. Yet in the rear view, a text waited with words meant to intimidate. Next time we won't miss it. The sentence did not rattle me the way it might have before training. Instead, it reinforced the need to remain vigilant. Threats say more about their senders than their targets. Once you accept that, their power fades. Night fell, and with it a tiredness that was not the exhaustion of a body alone. It was a heavy stamp of responsibility. I had chosen the path that kept publicity minimal and leverage maximal. Their lives would change irrevocably, not through spectacle but through structure. That is sometimes the crueler outcome. The following days were procedural. Banks complied with gentle nudges by Renee. Accounts froze. The shell companies slowed. The escrow took custody of originals. I notified a small circle of trusted associates and asked them to watch for movement, for calls, for anything that smelled of panic. The investigators trailed digital trails and mapped associates. Pieces that had been scattered started to pin down into clear frames. Dylan called once, his voice raw. He spoke apologies that tasted of guilt and was full of logistical requests. I listened and answered without anger, offering only the facts of the agreement. There was no catharsis in his sorrow. There was a consequence. I recorded every exchange. Documentation was a habit I could not drop. A week later, an anonymous parcel arrived at my door. Inside was a single old photograph of our family at the lake when we were children. Someone had cut the corner where my face had been. The act was petty and childish, and it told me more than 1,000 threats. They wanted to signal they could reach into my history and make it ugly. I folded the photo and placed it in a drawer where it could not be burned into my head. If you appreciate careful strategy over dramatic confrontation, tap like and let this method resonate. There is elegance in controlled response. We kept monitoring. Small failures followed them like a shadow. Vanessa attempted to move an item listed in a gallery that had been flagged by our investigator. The request was intercepted. A creditor called for immediate payment. Dylan tried to take his phone into a meeting and found voicemail messages queued from collectors. They were unraveling not because of spectacle, but because the structure around their lies collapsed under pressure. But the human cost was real. I felt the ache of a parentless family separating, of a brother who might now live with the consequences of his choices. I would not romanticize that pain. Survival often costs what we hold dear. It is a solitary ledger. One evening, months after the meeting, Evan stopped by unexpectedly. He stood in my doorway, awkward and formal as if waiting to be invited in. He had been offered a job quietly through the foundation I had set up in the aftermath. A small position running security for events that supported veterans. He looked at me with the kind of gratitude that is difficult to describe. "You gave me a second chance," he said without flourish. I nodded and felt something in my chest unclench. We had taken a step toward repair and reconstruction, not only of finances, but of purpose. The foundation began to take form, and in it I put names and programs that mattered to the women and men who had served. The money once destined for a different fate would now support therapy dogs, training programs, and legal clinics for veterans at risk of exploitation. The glass rose had broken. The shards would build something that could hold light. The legal scaffolding held, but life continued to test the edges of any agreement. People with loss often lash out in ways that surprise even themselves. Dylan oscillated between regret and resentment. Vanessa alternated between contrite and sharp. They were human and deeply flawed. I read them without malice because in many ways reading them was my work. Renee kept the file active. The DA made it clear that the moment the terms were violated, the indictment would move forward. The escrow was a kind of peacekeeper, an insurance policy enforced by law and by the quiet threat of evidence timed to publish if necessary. It is strange how power can be worn like clothing. You can hide it or don it. For now, it stayed folded in our briefcase. Every so often a small test arrived. A call from an old investor who wanted reassurance that none of the company assets would be compromised. A social media post designed to shame without saying names. A rumor slipped to a gallery. We neutralized them all with procedural care. The response was always the same: document, contain, escalate only when necessary. A friend from my unit called one afternoon. He had been watching the local papers and wanted to know if I was okay. There is a different currency to concern that comes from people who have watched you in combat. They know what quiet can hide. I assured him with the flat calm of someone who does not want to drag others into her fight. He said he would keep an eye in the background. That is the kind of support that matters. The strain of keeping everything sealed was not trivial. You cannot live with ironclad secrecy without letting some small things rust. I missed casual dinners where conversation did not feel like a minefield. I missed the simplicity of a laugh that did not have an edge. I mourned the brother I might have had if choices had been different. There is a loneliness to surviving family betrayal that does not come with metal ribbons. Then, in the slow quiet of a late autumn night, my attorney called. There had been a breach attempt. A transfer had been initiated from an account to a foreign intermediary flagged in our files. The bank had prevented movement, but the attempt showed intent. It also showed reach. Someone was testing the boundary. Our contingency was set. Renee prepared the DA packet for immediate referral if needed. The investigators traced the attempt to a set of VPN hops and a burner account. Technical footprints are not always tidy in the underworld, but they are rarely perfect. We decided to wait and watch. Patience is a craft. You let someone try to shift the board and then you remove the piece. They moved and we cut off their hands. That is the strategy of containment. It is messy but effective. The weeks that followed were sharp with small victories. The gallery returned items under question. The escrow seized a payment attempt. A creditor was placated with a legal notice. Dylan and Vanessa retreated from their public social life as calls dried up and favors evaporated. They grew smaller in public, and in private their disagreements hardened. I learned through a careful process of listening and watching that what they had once shared had been brittle, bound by causes that were not durable. Still, sometimes at night, when the house was quiet, I would think of my mother's letter. She had written that life sometimes breaks in ways you cannot repair, and that the measure of strength is how you gather the pieces. I took that to heart. The foundation would be one way to gather pieces. The legal containment would be another. The rest was time. In the end, Operation Glass Rose did exactly what it was meant to do. It removed the immediate danger. It redirected assets to a purpose that honored service instead of greed. It allowed me to keep a life without becoming a public spectacle. But more than that, it taught a lesson about how to respond when your enemy is family. You do not become them. You do not revel in ruin. You use rules and systems, not anger, to close the gap. If you believe in doing the hard work quietly, share this story and let the method travel farther than the wound. There is strength in measured response. Months later, life settled into a new normal. The foundation offices hummed with people who cared about the same small, important things I did. Veterans training programs were underway. Evan ran his security team with a calm professionalism that made me proud. Dylan and Vanessa were still present in my periphery in legal terms, bound by the agreement, living in the consequences they helped create. I felt sorrow sometimes, but sorrow is a different shape than rage. One day a letter arrived from Dylan. It was short, hesitant, and oddly sincere. He wrote that he was seeking help for his addiction to risky investments and that he wanted in time to try to make amends. The letter did not absolve him. It simply showed a man beginning to recognize the harm he had caused. I folded it and placed it in a file marked Things to Watch. Forgiveness is not a requirement of survival. It is, when it comes, a choice. The truth is complicated. If you lose trust in someone close, you have to choose between public battle and private structure. I chose structure and resolution. It was not always satisfying in the melodramatic way people imagine. It was methodical, bureaucratic, sometimes painfully slow, but it worked. When the first annual report for the foundation arrived, listing grants awarded to therapy programs and a scholarship fund, I sat with a cup of coffee and let the numbers speak. Hundreds of thousands redirected, programs supported, people helped. What could have been a story about betrayal had become a story about repair. The glass rose refracted not just the sting of what had been, but the light of what could be. If this approach speaks to you, consider supporting causes that protect veterans from predatory financial schemes. Share the message that strength can be quiet and still powerful. The fight is not always public. Sometimes the quiet work is where the world gets saved. The cursor blinked on the empty screen, waiting, a black rectangle with a white pulse. After all the noise, all the calculations, all the precision, this was the quietest part of any mission. The report. You write it not because you want to relive what happened, but because you owe it to the truth, to record what you did and why you had to do it. Operation Glass Rose, status completed, losses, trust, survivor, integrity. I typed those words slowly, each letter pressing against memory. Military reports had always been about logistics, names, ranks, positions, outcomes, but this one was personal. It wasn't just about tactics or containment. It was about the cost of carrying your principles into a battlefield that wears family faces. I had learned in the army that clarity saves lives. In civilian life, it saves sanity, so I laid out the sequence with military precision. Threat detected, evidence confirmed. Mission parameters adjusted to preserve both justice and dignity. No civilian casualties, collateral damage, emotional, extensive. Objective met with controlled exposure. Recommend declassification in 1 year for review of legal stability. The words felt clinical, detached. They were supposed to. Emotion contaminates judgment. Still, when I reached the line labeled personnel, I hesitated. Under supporting operatives, I wrote one name, Evan J. Miller. Civilian contractor, then paused before adding a note, exceeded expectations under moral duress, maintained operational discretion under pressure, recommended for commendation and future trust assignments. That was my way of saying thank you. I printed the page, folded it, and slipped it into a plain white envelope. Then I added a check, not large, but enough to mean something. I wrote a short line on the note that accompanied it, for the soldier who remembered his training. He would understand. Gratitude never needs many words when it's written in a shared language. That evening, I sat by the window of my apartment overlooking the bay. The city lights trembled on the water, thin as breath. The wind moved gently against the glass, and for once, I let it move through me. On the table beside me was a wine glass, empty, clear, no red, no stain, just the reflection of light inside a vessel that could have held poison but now held peace. Outside, the world hummed with the kind of indifference that used to make me restless. Now it felt right. There's a rhythm in being invisible when your work is done. I poured a small amount of water into the glass and held it up to the light. Clean, transparent, unbroken, that was enough. In the reflection on the window, I caught a glimpse of myself, older, sharper, quieter. My uniform had been replaced by civilian clothes, my medals by scars no one could see. But the discipline remained. That part of a soldier never fades. It only shifts into a quieter kind of readiness. If you've ever stood at the end of a storm and realized victory doesn't feel like triumph, you know this feeling. It's not joy. It's not even a relief. It's the deep stillness that comes when every part of you has done its job and survived the consequences. The knock at the door came late. When I opened it, there was no one there, just an envelope on the floor. Inside, a single photograph, our unit dusty and smiling, years ago under the desert sun. On the back, written in thick black ink, were the words, "You trained me well." I smiled for the first time in months. That was Evan's way of saying goodbye without needing to say it out loud. Soldiers rarely waste words on closure. I went back to the table, laid the photo beside the empty glass, and turned back to my report. The cursor waited where I had left it. I finished the final section, recommendations, maintain perimeter vigilance, reallocate emotional resources toward constructive projects, avoid unnecessary contact with compromised relations, reaffirm identity through service, and then beneath it a final line, war teaches you how to fight, life teaches you when not to. The act of typing it felt like setting down a weapon. If this part of the story reaches you, hold onto this truth. Strength isn't in striking back. It's in knowing when to stand still, when to walk away, when to rebuild quietly. The missions that change you the most are the ones no one ever sees. That night, I closed the file, encrypted it, and labeled it with one word, legacy. It would stay locked until someone needed to understand how to win without bloodshed. The next morning, I mailed Evan's envelope from a small post office near the pier. No return address, just his name, a city, and a trust in timing. Some messages find their way not through tracking numbers, but through the gravity of intent. When I walked back along the dock, the sun was cutting a clean line across the water. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to plan or calculate. The mission was done, the noise had quieted, the glass had held. Morning light poured across the table like a slow revelation. For months, my life had been a collection of operations, court filings, and contingency plans. Now there was just quiet. I sat with my coffee, watching the steam rise and twist. That was how the body reminds you it's still here. You learn to measure peace not by the absence of noise, but by how you breathe inside it. I turned my phone face down. No alerts, no threats. No pings from lawyers or investigators. The silence was almost foreign, but healing is never loud. It's something that arrives disguised as stillness. The foundation had become my new campaign. Evan was thriving in his role, managing a small team of veterans providing security for local nonprofits. I'd read his latest report, efficient, disciplined, understated. He had signed it with a single word at the bottom, solid. That's what he had become. Solid, reliable. A man rebuilt from fracture, the kind of soldier who no longer needed orders to do the right thing. One afternoon, Renee visited the office. She carried no files, just 2 coffees and that sharp smile that meant she was proud of me but would never say it directly. We sat by the window overlooking the street where traffic pulsed like blood through veins. She asked if I'd heard from Dylan. I shook my head. She said she'd been told Vanessa had left town, some quiet divorce settlement, no scandal, no papers. Just disappeared. We didn't talk about forgiveness. Some words don't belong in the same room as betrayal. Instead, Renee said something that stayed with me. She said the hardest missions are the ones without medals, but they still count. When she left, I wrote that line down on a sticky note and put it on my monitor. It became my silent motto. A small truth that steadied me on long days. Weeks turned into months. Dylan's name surfaced only once more, a letter forwarded by the attorney. He was in a rehab program for compulsive gambling and financial dependency. His handwriting looked unfamiliar, shaky but human. He didn't ask for anything. He just wrote that he'd finally realized who he'd been trying to impress all his life. Not investors, not Vanessa, me. He ended the letter with a simple wish. I hope someday I can be the kind of soldier you are, even out of uniform. I read it twice, folded it carefully, and filed it under personal closed. Some things you don't answer, not because you don't care, but because silence is the only reply that respects what the other person is trying to learn. That night, I took a walk by the river. The air had that crisp edge of early winter, the kind that makes you feel alive in your bones. Streetlights flickered on the water, and for a moment I saw a reflection of the woman I had been, a soldier with clear rules, boundaries, and missions. The one who believed everything had to be won or lost. But war ends differently for everyone. Some of us carry it in ways no one sees. I remembered the faces of my unit. The laughter during downtime, the sandstorms, the exhaustion that forged trust deeper than blood. I thought about how easily that trust could erode in the civilian world, replaced by contracts, signatures, betrayals wrapped in polite smiles. Yet even now, I didn't regret having loved my brother or believed in him. Trust misplaced still means you had the courage to trust, and that courage matters. I returned home and opened my laptop one last time. The after-action report sat there waiting, the file icon glowing faintly in the dark. I added one more paragraph at the end. Addendum, emotional reconstruction phase initiated. Mission success redefined. Revenge avoided. Peace achieved through structure and purpose. Recommendation, future operatives should remember that justice delivered with restraint carries more weight than vengeance delivered with fury. I saved it and encrypted the file. Then I renamed it from Operation Glass Rose to Operation Homecoming, because that's what it had become, a return to self. On the shelf behind me sat a small frame. Inside was a photograph of my unit, and beside it, the check stub from the Foundation's first grant to a female veteran startup. That check had built a program training women to transition from service to civilian careers in cybersecurity. It was concrete, real, forward, a mission worth continuing. I poured a single glass of wine, the same vintage that had once been weaponized against me. This time it was safe. I swirled it gently, watching the light catch the surface. No poison, no deceit, just the memory of what survival costs and the quiet satisfaction of paying that price in full. Outside. The city breathed. People moved on sidewalks, cars glided through intersections, ordinary lives continued. That was the beauty of peace. It rarely makes headlines. I leaned back, my reflection clear in the window glass. For the first time in a long time, I saw no enemy there. Just a woman who had done her duty, lost what needed to be lost, and gained something harder to name, clarity. If you followed this far, remember this: strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits at a kitchen table, writing the truth into a report no one will ever read, and knowing that is enough. I closed my eyes and whispered the line I had written days ago. Now etched deep into my bones, war teaches you how to fight. Life teaches you when not to. The wind shifted. The candle beside me flickered. Somewhere in the distance, the night gave up its noise and silence reclaimed its ground. Some people think enemies wear uniforms, but I've seen betrayal wear wedding rings, polished smiles, and family ties. I've seen it sit across the table, speaking softly while planning your end. And still, I survived it, not because I was stronger, but because I refused to let the darkness teach me its language. The apartment was quiet, bathed in late afternoon gold. I reached into the drawer and took out my old army badge. The metal was scratched and dulled by years. Yet under the light, it still caught a clean glint, like memory refusing to fade. I set it on the table beside the empty wine glass. The sound was small, but it carried weight. That badge had once meant duty, loyalty, brotherhood. Now it meant something different. It meant I had faced another kind of battlefield and walked away with my honor intact. They wanted my money. They forgot I earned every cent surviving battlefields they will never understand. They thought wealth could replace worth. But real value isn't measured in what you have, it's measured in what you refuse to lose. Not every victory comes from pulling a trigger. Some wars are fought in silence, with restraint as your weapon and integrity as your armor. There are wounds you don't treat with bandages, but with boundaries. Trust, once broken, can't be repaired by blood or blame, only by the quiet dignity of those who survive it. If this story touched something in you, let it remind you of this truth. Strength isn't loud, it's steady. It's the choice to stand up, to protect your name, and to walk away still whole. If this story hit home, like, share, and subscribe. Because somewhere out there, another soldier is still fighting the quiet war of survival.